In the late autumn of 1941, at Wright Field near Dayton, Ohio, a U.S. Army Air Forces officer faced a decision that could quietly end everything he had worked for. Lieutenant Colonel Benjamin S. Kelsey remained in his office well past nightfall, aware that the phone call he was about to make directly violated standing doctrine. The rules were explicit and non-negotiable. Fighter aircraft were not to be equipped with external fuel tanks under any circumstances. This prohibition was not a misunderstanding or a temporary policy. It was a cornerstone of American air power theory at the time. Senior officers who dominated air doctrine believed they had already solved the problem of modern warfare. Their answer was the heavy bomber. Fighters, in their view, played only a supporting role and did not need extended range. External fuel tanks were seen as unnecessary, inefficient, and even dangerous. Kelsey disagreed. Unlike many of his superiors, he understood a simple but deadly reality. Without increased range, American fighters would be unable to escort bombers once they crossed deep into enemy territory. Bombers flying alone would be exposed, crews would be lost, missions would fail. And if a major war broke out, as intelligence reports increasingly suggested, it could cost the United States dearly. Knowing this, Kelsey made his choice. He contacted engineers he trusted at the Lockheed Aircraft Corporation. Nothing was put on paper. There were no formal requests, no official approvals, and no documentation that could be traced. Instead, there was only mutual understanding between professionals who saw the same future approaching fast. Under this unofficial arrangement, 100 P-38 Lightning fighters would be quietly altered. Fuel lines would be installed, structural hardpoints would be added. The aircraft would gain the ability to carry external fuel tanks despite clear orders forbidding exactly that. If the modification were discovered, Kelsey intended to accept full responsibility. His career, his rank, and his reputation would be sacrificed without hesitation. At the time, he had no idea just how far-reaching the consequences of this decision would be. 16 months later, on April 18, 1943, that hidden gamble would reveal its true significance. 18 P-38 Lightnings lifted off from a rough airstrip on Guadalcanal, each aircraft burdened with an unprecedented fuel load. No fighter formation had ever attempted a combat flight at such extreme range. The pilots would fly hundreds of miles over open ocean at extremely low altitude, guided only by magnetic compass readings, airspeed calculations, and synchronized wristwatches. There would be no radio communication, no margin for error. Missing the interception point by even a few minutes would doom the mission. Remarkably, the fighters arrived within a single minute of their planned timing. Their target was Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, the mastermind behind the attack on Pearl Harbor and the most strategically valuable officer in the Imperial Japanese Navy. The mission succeeded. Yamamoto was killed, and one of the most daring aerial operations of the Second World War entered history. None of it would have been possible without the extended range granted by those forbidden fuel tanks. This story does not begin with gunfire or explosions. It begins with institutional conflict inside the U.S. Army Air Forces. It is a case study in how rigid doctrine can blind decision-makers even in the face of obvious evidence. Engineers and pilots recognized the limits of existing fighter aircraft, while senior leadership clung to theories that had not yet been tested by real combat. It is also a story shaped by intelligence. Codebreakers had provided American commanders with information of extraordinary value, information so sensitive that some feared acting on it might reveal their cryptographic success. And ultimately, it is a story of 18 pilots who carried out a mission that many planners believed could not be done at all, succeeding through innovation, precision navigation, and a level of risk that bordered on the extreme. From a technical standpoint, the problem was straightforward. In 1941, most fighter aircraft could only operate effectively within a limited radius. Their fuel capacity restricted them to short-range missions. Meanwhile, heavy bombers were expected to strike targets far beyond that range. Without escort, those bombers would face concentrated enemy defenses alone. The logical solution, adding detachable fuel tanks to fighters, was obvious to those working directly with the aircraft. It would increase range, preserve maneuverability once the tanks were dropped, and dramatically improve bomber survival. Yet this solution was rejected outright by a powerful group of officers often referred to by critics as the bomber mafia. These men believed unwaveringly in strategic bombing as the decisive tool of modern war. They argued that bomber formations, tightly packed and heavily armed, could defend themselves against any enemy fighters. Escort aircraft, they claimed, were unnecessary. Worse, they were a waste of resources that could be better used to produce more bombers. The theory was clean, confident, and supported by mathematical models. Unfortunately, it was also dangerously flawed. By the early 1942s, this group controlled nearly every major decision related to aircraft development. Their influence extended to formal bans. External fuel tanks were discouraged, then prohibited outright. Fighters were not to be redesigned for extended range. Research in that direction was halted. Officers who challenged this policy risked professional ruin. Benjamin Scoville Kelsey was not a reckless man, but he was deeply informed. Born on March 9, 1906, in Waterbury, Connecticut, he developed an early fascination with flight and engineering. He attended the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, earning a degree in mechanical engineering in 1928 and later completing a master's degree in aeronautics in 1932. His technical background allowed him to see what doctrine ignored: wars are not won by theory alone. In defying policy, Kelsey did not seek recognition or credit. He acted because he believed future pilots' lives depended on it. History would eventually prove him right. During the late 1920s and early 1930s, aviation engineering was still finding its identity. Powered flight itself was barely a few decades old, and the science behind high-performance military aircraft was being written in real time by a small group of engineers, pilots, and risk-takers. It was into this experimental world that Benjamin S. Kelsey stepped when he entered the U.S. Army Air Corps on May 2, 1929. Kelsey quickly distinguished himself as more than just a capable aviator. He possessed a rare dual talent: the ability to fly aircraft at the limits of their performance, and the technical insight to understand how every major system worked together, from the geometry of a propeller blade to the stresses carried by the tail structure. This combination made him invaluable at a time when the Air Corps desperately needed officers who could bridge theory and practice. By 1934, Kelsey had been assigned to Wright Field in Ohio, the nerve center of American military aviation research and procurement. There, he became a fighter projects officer, a role that placed him at the crossroads of design, testing, and policy. Over the next 11 years, few individuals would exert more influence over which American fighter aircraft were funded, refined, or abandoned before reaching the front lines. Kelsey operated under the authority of Colonel Oliver Patton Eccles, the Air Force's chief of materiel throughout the Second World War. Eccles was not a tactician or a pilot, but a master administrator with an unusually clear understanding of modern warfare. He believed future conflicts would be decided less by battlefield heroics and more by factories, logistics, and technological superiority. That belief shaped every decision he made. Recognizing Kelsey's instincts and judgment, Eccles granted him remarkable freedom. Projects that challenged established doctrine, particularly those that threatened the dominance of long-range bombers, often survived because Eccles allowed Kelsey to pursue them quietly. When powerful factions within the Air Corps objected, Eccles absorbed the political pressure. When regulations proved inconvenient, he allowed flexibility. Decades later, Kelsey would credit Eccles as the man who truly won World War II, acknowledging that without his protection, many decisive innovations would never have left the drawing board. The aircraft most closely associated with Kelsey's legacy was the Lockheed P-38 Lightning. Conceived in response to a 1937 requirement for a fast, high-altitude interceptor, the design broke sharply from convention. Instead of a single fuselage, the P-38 featured two slender tailbooms housing its engines, connected by a central nacelle that carried the cockpit and all forward-firing weapons. The layout was unconventional, but it solved multiple problems at once. Power came from a pair of Allison V1710 engines. This not only delivered exceptional performance, but also introduced redundancy rarely seen in fighters of the era. If one engine failed, The aircraft could remain airborne on the other, an advantage that would later prove critical over the immense distances of the Pacific theater. Firepower was concentrated entirely in the nose, a single 20mm cannon supported by 450 caliber machine guns. Unlike wing-mounted guns, these weapons did not require convergence, allowing pilots to deliver accurate fire at much greater distances. Kelsey personally took the prototype XP-38 into the air for its maiden flight on January 27, 1939, lifting off from March Field in California. The flight validated the aircraft's promise, but convincing senior leadership would require more than test data. 2 weeks later, on February 11, Kelsey attempted a dramatic demonstration, a non-stop transcontinental dash meant to showcase the Lightning's speed and endurance. Departing California in mid-morning, Kelsey climbed to 20,000 feet and pushed the aircraft hard across the continent. After 7 hours and 48 minutes, he approached Mitchell Field near New York, having shattered the existing coast-to-coast speed record. The achievement, however, ended in disaster. As he prepared to land, ice formed in the carburetors, starving both engines of power. With no thrust available, Kelsey was forced into an emergency landing on a nearby golf course. The XP-38 was destroyed on impact, becoming a total loss. Kelsey escaped with only minor injuries. Although the accident threatened to derail the program, Kelsey refused to let it die. The record-setting flight had proven the aircraft's raw capability, and its performance eclipsed anything else then available to the US military. The safety advantages of a twin-engine fighter were impossible to ignore. Contracts moved forward, and production began at Lockheed's Burbank facilities. By the middle of 1941, P-38 Lightnings were entering service. They were fast, heavily armed, and capable of climbing to altitude faster than nearly any contemporary fighter. Yet the aircraft still suffered from a critical limitation: endurance. Early variants carried roughly 306 gallons of internal fuel. Later models would increase this capacity significantly, but those improvements were still years away. At cruising speeds, the early P-38 could cover roughly 900 miles. This made it suitable for homeland defense and interception missions, but it lacked the reach required for sustained offensive operations deep into enemy territory. Solving that limitation would become one of the central challenges of the Lightning's wartime evolution and a defining chapter in the story of American air power. Long-range air war posed a problem that early fighter doctrine had never truly confronted. Whether over the industrial heartland of Europe or the immense emptiness of the Pacific Ocean, bomber formations could not survive without escort fighters able to travel extraordinary distances, often well beyond 1,200 miles. For engineers, the answer was straightforward and already proven: detachable external fuel tanks that could be discarded once empty or before combat. The concept was neither radical nor untested. By 1940, Japanese Zero fighters were already flying with drop tanks as standard equipment. Yet within the United States Army Air Forces, the idea was effectively forbidden. Prevailing doctrine, shaped by the so-called bomber mafia, held that bombers could defend themselves and that fighters existed primarily for short-range interception. External tanks were seen as unnecessary, even undesirable. One officer saw the flaw in this thinking with unsettling clarity: Lieutenant Colonel Benjamin S. Kelsey. He recognized the direction global events were moving. Germany's war in Europe was expanding rapidly, and Japan's aggressive campaigns across East and Southeast Asia were steadily encroaching on American strategic interests. Any future conflict, Kelsey believed, would be fought across distances that would push US logistics and air power to their limits. Fighters depending solely on internal fuel would simply not be enough. Kelsey understood that time was running out and that formal channels would fail him. So he chose a quieter path. In November 1941, barely a month before the United States would be drawn into war, Kelsey reached out directly to Lockheed Aircraft Corporation. The exchange was brief, cautious, and deliberately vague. He proposed that 100 P-38E Lightning fighters already moving through production be modified to accept external fuel tanks. The request was clear in intent, if not in writing. Fuel lines would need to be extended from the internal system to reinforced hardpoints beneath the wings. The tanks would have to remain secure during flight, yet release instantly at the pilot's command from inside the cockpit. Lockheed's engineers grasped the significance immediately. They also understood something else just as clearly. This work would never appear in official paperwork. There would be no authorization, no signatures, no trail. The project was unofficial, technically insubordinate, and strategically vital. Agreement was reached with nothing more than a handshake. Over the next several weeks, Lockheed quietly transformed the aircraft. Structural reinforcements were added beneath the wings. Fuel plumbing was integrated seamlessly into existing systems. Electrical controls were adapted so pilots could choose whether to draw fuel from internal tanks or the external ones. Everything was done with discretion. To an untrained eye, the modified P-38 seconds appeared no different from any other Lightning rolling off the line. But their operational reach had changed dramatically. What remained was the most complex task of all, designing the tanks themselves. Creating reliable external fuel tanks proved far more demanding than it initially seemed. Aerodynamic efficiency was critical. Excessive drag could negate the benefits of additional fuel. The tanks had to endure vibration, airflow, and maneuvering stresses without failure while remaining light enough not to compromise performance. They had to seal flawlessly, even at high altitudes where freezing temperatures could cause leaks or pressure issues. Fuel had to transfer smoothly through pumps and valves without interruption. And when released, the tanks needed to fall cleanly away without striking propellers, tail surfaces, or engine nacelles. Lockheed's solution was a streamlined, teardrop-shaped aluminum tank produced in two primary sizes. The smaller version carried approximately 165 gallons of fuel. The larger model held around 300 gallons, with some variations reaching up to 330 gallons depending on configuration and fuel density calculations. Each tank measured roughly 13 feet in length and about 3 feet at its widest point. Mounting locations were carefully chosen. Positioned between the fuselage and the engines, close to the aircraft's centerline, the tanks minimized handling issues even if a pilot carried mismatched sizes on each wing. The result was a system that was balanced, efficient, and operationally transformative. It was also in direct contradiction to official U.S. air doctrine. By early December 1941, the first P-38 fighters equipped with drop tank capability were completing final evaluations at Lockheed's facility in Burbank, California. Tests confirmed the system's reliability. Fuel transfer worked as intended. Jettison mechanisms functioned flawlessly. Without public acknowledgement or bureaucratic approval, Kelsey had quietly armed American fighter pilots with a capability they would soon depend upon for survival. Then history intervened. On the morning of December 7, 1941, Japanese carrier-based aircraft struck the U.S. Pacific Fleet at Pearl Harbor. In a single devastating attack, 243 Americans were killed and 1,178 wounded. 18 ships were sunk or damaged. 8 battleships were hit, 4 of them lost entirely. The USS Arizona detonated catastrophically and sank at her moorings, taking 1,177 crewmen with her. The Oklahoma capsized, trapping hundreds of sailors inside her overturned hull. The Japanese task force withdrew without losing a single capital ship. It was a stunning tactical success, precisely executed, meticulously planned, and devastatingly effective. The architect of the operation was Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto. America was now at war, and every long-held assumption about air combat, range, and fighter doctrine was about to be tested under the unforgiving conditions of real combat. Isoroku Yamamoto entered the world on April 4, 1884, in the rural town of Nagano, Japan. He was born into an academic household. His father was a schoolmaster, and Yamamoto was the 6th son in the family. His given name, Isoroku, literally meant 56, a reference to his father's age at the time of his birth, a traditional naming custom in Japan during that era. From an early age, Yamamoto showed promise, eventually earning admission to the Imperial Japanese Naval Academy. He graduated in 1904, just as Japan entered a major conflict with Imperial Russia. Almost immediately, the young officer was thrust into combat during the Russo-Japanese War, a defining experience that would shape his understanding of warfare. On May 27, 1905, during the Battle of Tsushima, Yamamoto was serving aboard the armored cruiser Nishin as it engaged the Russian Baltic Fleet. In the chaos of battle, an enemy shell detonated near his position. Metal fragments ripped through his body, costing him 2 fingers on his left hand and leaving deep, permanent scars across his abdomen. At just 21 years old, Yamamoto learned a harsh lesson. Modern naval combat was swift, merciless, and unforgiving, offering little room for error or sentiment. Despite his injuries, Yamamoto's career advanced steadily in the years following the war. He distinguished himself not only as a capable officer, but as a thinker willing to challenge assumptions. Between 1919 and 1921, he studied in the United States at Harvard University, where he learned fluent English and immersed himself in economics, global trade, While in America, Yamamoto traveled extensively across the country. He observed factories, shipyards, rail networks, and oil infrastructure firsthand. What struck him most was not American culture or politics, but industrial scale. The sheer productive capacity of the United States left a lasting impression on him. This experience deeply influenced his strategic worldview. Yamamoto later returned to the United States twice as Japan's naval attaché in Washington, D.C. In this role, he closely monitored American naval expansion, shipbuilding programs, and long-term war planning. By the late 1932s, his expertise and seniority earned him command of the Imperial Japanese Navy's First Fleet. In 1939, he was appointed Commander-in-Chief of the Combined Fleet, the most powerful and influential position in Japan's naval hierarchy. Despite his reputation as a bold strategist, Yamamoto was firmly opposed to war with the United States. Unlike many Japanese leaders, he had no illusions about American weakness. He understood that while Japan might achieve early victories, it could not match the United States in a prolonged industrial war. He famously warned that Japan might dominate the battlefield for 6 months, perhaps a year, but beyond that point, he saw no path to victory. His warnings went unheeded. Japan's political and military leadership believed American democracy lacked the unity and endurance required for sustained conflict. Yamamoto knew this assessment was dangerously wrong. Still, once Japan committed to war, he resolved to design a strategy that offered his country its best possible chance. That strategy culminated in the attack on Pearl Harbor. Yamamoto envisioned a decisive opening blow that would cripple American naval power in the Pacific, buying Japan precious time to seize oil-rich territories across Southeast Asia. The strike achieved surprise and inflicted severe damage, but it fell short of its ultimate goal. The American aircraft carriers, the true backbone of modern naval warfare, were not in port. Worse still, the attack unified American public opinion with a speed and intensity Japanese planners had never anticipated. The industrial giant Yamamoto feared had awakened. 6 months later, Yamamoto attempted to force a decisive confrontation near Midway Atoll. His plan was complex and ambitious, designed to lure American carriers into battle and annihilate them. Central to the operation was a fatal assumption that Japanese naval communications were secure. They were not. American cryptographers had broken Japan's JN-25 naval code. They intercepted Yamamoto's orders, deciphered his strategy, and positioned 3 U.S. aircraft carriers for a carefully planned ambush. The Battle of Midway, fought between June 4 and June 7, 1942, marked a turning point in the Pacific War. On June 4 alone, 4 Japanese fleet carriers were destroyed. Hundreds of elite pilots, men who could not be easily replaced, were lost. Although the USS Yorktown was badly damaged and eventually sank on June 7, the strategic balance of power had shifted permanently. Japan would never recover from the losses sustained at Midway. Yamamoto survived the battle, but his strategic gamble had failed. The brief period of dominance he had predicted was over. What followed was the war he had always feared, a slow, relentless battle of attrition. By early 1943, the momentum in the Pacific had clearly turned against Japan. American forces had landed on Guadalcanal in August 1942, initiating a brutal campaign that dragged on for 6 exhausting months. Japanese troops fought with extreme determination, but material realities were impossible to ignore. American factories vastly outproduced Japan. Where Japan built 1 aircraft, the United States built 5. Where Japan launched 1 ship, America launched 10. The numbers told a story no ideology could overcome. In April 1943, Yamamoto authorized Operation 11, a large-scale aerial campaign aimed at slowing the Allied advance through the Solomon Islands and New Guinea. Between April 1 and April 16, roughly 350 Japanese aircraft carried out coordinated strikes against Allied positions. The objective was not victory, but delay to disrupt enemy operations, restore morale, and buy time. Yamamoto understood that these actions could not change the outcome of the war. They could only postpone the inevitable. After the operation concluded, Yamamoto decided to personally inspect forward bases in the northern Solomon Islands. His goal was to encourage troops and assess the damage firsthand. His staff prepared an exact flight schedule detailing departure times, routes, aircraft types, and escort arrangements. The itinerary was encoded using the JN-25D naval cipher and transmitted on April 13, 1943. The following day, American radio listening stations intercepted the message. It was forwarded to the Fleet Radio Unit Pacific at Pearl Harbor, known as Station HYPO. There, naval intelligence personnel analyzed the transmission. Among them was John Paul Stevens, a traffic analyst who would decades later serve on the U.S. Supreme Court. While Stevens did not break the code himself, cryptographic specialists quickly decrypted the message in full. Within hours, American intelligence had Yamamoto's complete travel plan, his flight path, timing, destination, aircraft, and escort strength. It was a perfect opportunity. The intelligence reached Admiral Chester W. Nimitz, commander of the U.S. Pacific Fleet. He immediately recognized the stakes. Yamamoto was Japan's most capable naval commander and a powerful symbol of its early success. Eliminating him could deal a severe psychological and operational blow. But acting on the information carried a serious risk. If Japan realized its codes were compromised, the Allies would lose a priceless advantage. The decision was escalated to Washington. Secretary of the Navy Frank Knox briefed President Franklin D. Roosevelt. While accounts differ on the exact wording, the message from the White House was unmistakable. The mission was approved. Nimitz authorized the operation and passed it to Admiral William Halsey in the South Pacific. Halsey then tasked Rear Admiral Mark Mitchell with planning the interception. The operation would be daring, precise, and dangerous, but the opportunity was too significant to ignore. The hunt for Admiral Yamamoto had begun. Mitch established his command center at Henderson Field on Guadalcanal. An airstrip wrested from Japanese control after months of relentless and bloody combat. What had once been a key enemy base was now the nerve center of Allied air operations in the Solomon Islands. From this battered runway, Mitch exercised authority over a complex mix of Navy, Marine Corps, and Army Air Forces squadrons spread across the region. When the intelligence reports arrived, Mitch reviewed them carefully. The conclusion was immediate and unavoidable. The mission's defining obstacle was distance. The planned interception zone, located west of Bougainville Island, lay roughly 435 miles from Henderson Field if measured in a straight line. However, flying directly toward the target was not an option. Japanese coast watches and early warning radar stations dotted the Solomon Islands, and avoiding detection was critical. To remain unseen, the strike force would need to follow a winding course to the south and west, adding at least another 150 miles to the outbound journey. This meant the attacking aircraft would have to travel close to 600 miles just to reach the target. After the interception, the return leg could be flown more directly. Even so, the total mission length would approach 1,000 miles. No fighter aircraft stationed at Henderson Field could manage such a distance. In fact, no fighter operating anywhere in the Pacific Theater could accept one. That exception was the Lockheed P-38 Lightning. The P-38G variant, currently serving in the South Pacific, carried 306 gallons of fuel internally when flown at standard cruise settings. Under ideal conditions, this gave it a maximum range of around 900 miles, still not enough to complete the planned operation. However, a series of unofficial modifications introduced earlier by General George Kenney's command had transformed the aircraft's capabilities. The Lightning could be fitted with external fuel tanks mounted beneath its wings. With standard 165-gallon drop tanks installed under each wing, a P-38 could carry an additional 330 gallons of fuel, nearly doubling its endurance. Even so, this configuration only barely met the requirements of a 1,000-mile mission that also demanded 10 to 15 minutes of high-power combat maneuvering. Mitch's intelligence and operations officers ran the numbers repeatedly, leaving no room for optimism or guesswork. The aircraft would need to fly approximately 600 miles at extremely low altitude, skimming the ocean surface through dense, humid tropical air conditions that significantly increased fuel consumption. Upon reaching the target area, the pilots would spend up to a quarter of an hour in combat, pushing their engines to maximum output. The return flight, about 400 miles, would include a gradual climb to higher altitude, where thinner air allowed for better fuel efficiency. The margins were razor-thin. Every gallon of fuel was critical. The calculations revealed a harsh truth. The standard 165-gallon drop tanks were insufficient. What the mission required were the larger 300-gallon external tanks. Unfortunately, those tanks were nowhere to be found on Guadalcanal. The 3 P-38 squadrons based at Henderson Field had been requesting additional drop tanks for weeks. Army supply channels moved slowly, and the Southwest Pacific ranked low on the overall priority list. While some 165-gallon tanks were available, they were not enough to outfit all 18 aircraft needed for the mission. The larger tanks simply did not exist on the island. If the operation was to proceed, the necessary equipment would have to be located, transported, and delivered immediately. This was where Mitch's rank made the difference. Exerting the kind of influence only an admiral possessed, he bypassed normal procedures. That same night, transport aircraft lifted off from Port Moresby, New Guinea, carrying an exceptionally valuable cargo, 20 oversized drop tanks, each capable of holding 300 gallons of fuel. Flying hundreds of miles over open ocean in total darkness, the cargo planes relied solely on instruments to guide them toward Guadalcanal. Their objective was clear: reach Henderson Field before sunrise. Ground crews were already waiting when the transports touched down. The moment the aircraft stopped rolling, mechanics rushed forward and began work. Each P-38 was fitted with an unusual fuel configuration, one 300-gallon tank on one wing and one 165-gallon tank on the other. This uneven arrangement placed nearly 1,000 extra pounds on one side of the aircraft. However, because the mounting points were positioned close to the fuselage centerline, experienced pilots could compensate for the imbalance. By first light, all 18 P-38 Lightnings were prepared for what would become the longest fighter mission yet attempted in the Pacific War. Leadership of the operation was assigned to Major John Mitchell, commander of the 339th Fighter Squadron. At just 32 years old, Mitchell was already a proven combat pilot with 5 confirmed aerial victories. Originally from Enid, Mississippi, he had earned a reputation for calm decision-making and exceptional navigational skill qualities that would be indispensable. The mission briefing left no room for ambiguity. Mitchell would guide 18 P-38 seconds across 600 miles of open ocean using only dead reckoning. Once airborne, radio silence was absolute. Any transmission could alert Japanese radar operators and compromise the entire operation. Navigation would depend entirely on compass headings, airspeed calculations, and precise timekeeping. After roughly 2 hours of flight at wave-top altitude, the formation was expected to reach the interception point exactly 10 minutes before the scheduled arrival of Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto at Balali Airstrip. The timing window was unforgiving. Arriving too early risked detection. Arriving too late meant Yamamoto would already be on the ground, protected by hundreds of soldiers and up to 750 fighter aircraft stationed at Kahili Airfield on Bougainville. Aware of what was at stake, Mitchell requested a final modification to his aircraft: the installation of a Navy-grade compass. The standard Army compasses fitted to P38 seconds were serviceable for routine operations, but this mission demanded exceptional accuracy. A Marine Corps officer, Lieutenant Colonel Luther Moore, supplied a Navy compass known for superior stability and precision. Ground crews installed it in Mitchell's cockpit during the night before departure. In an operation defined by margins measured in seconds, even such a small advantage could prove decisive. The strike force was divided into two elements. 4 aircraft would form the attack unit, tasked with directly engaging Yamamoto's transport aircraft. The remaining 14 Lightnings, led by Mitchell himself, would fly top cover. Their role was to counter Japanese fighter escorts and maintain an altitude advantage in case additional enemy aircraft launched from Kahili. Command of the attack element was given to Captain Thomas Lanphier Jr., a 24-year-old pilot from Detroit who had already achieved multiple aerial victories. Flying as his wingman was First Lieutenant Rex Barber, accompanied by First Lieutenants Besby Holmes and Raymond Hine. Intelligence reports indicated that Yamamoto would be traveling aboard a Mitsubishi G4M bomber, known to Allied forces as the Betty. Originally designed as a long-range medium bomber, the aircraft had been adapted for transport duties. While fast and capable of impressive range, it was critically vulnerable to achieve its endurance. Japanese designers had eliminated armor plating and self-sealing fuel tanks. As a result, even minor damage often caused catastrophic fires. American pilots grimly nicknamed it the Flying Zippo. Yamamoto's escort consisted of 6 Mitsubishi A6M0 fighters from the 204th Kokutai. The Zero was highly agile and lethal in close-range combat, particularly at low altitude. However, many Zeros operating from Bougainville were not equipped with radios, a weight-saving measure that severely limited coordination during unexpected engagements. On the evening of April 17, Mitchell assembled the selected pilots inside a cramped operations bunker near the runway. The air was thick with heat, cigarette smoke, and tension. Maps were spread across a table as senior Navy and Marine officers, men who knew the Solomon Islands airspace intimately, looked on. With deliberate precision, Mitchell traced the planned route across the charts, 5 distinct legs, each calculated to the mile and minute. There would be no second chances. The flight plan was brutally complex. From Guadalcanal, the aircraft would first head southwest for roughly 85 miles. From there, the formation would alter course to the northwest and continue for another 160 miles, followed by a westward leg of approximately 135 miles. After that came a turn toward the north-northeast for 75 miles, before a final northwest heading that would bring them directly to the interception point. The entire outbound journey would cover close to 600 miles, all without modern navigation aids. To reduce the risk of detection, the fighters would skim the ocean at barely 50 feet above the waves, flying below most enemy radar coverage. Visual navigation would be minimal. Pilots might occasionally spot distant islands, but otherwise the mission relied almost entirely on dead reckoning. Every correction for wind drift, every heading adjustment had to be exact. The success of the mission rested largely on one man, Major John Mitchell, whose ability to maintain precise navigation under extreme conditions would determine whether the target was found at all. During the briefing, one of the pilots raised a concern about fuel reserves. Mitchell did not sugarcoat the situation. With internal fuel tanks filled and external drop tanks attached, the aircraft would have enough fuel for approximately 10 minutes of full power operation in the combat area. That margin allowed just enough time to locate the target, attack, and disengage. There was no buffer. Stronger than expected headwinds could mean the difference between returning home or ditching at sea. If the engagement lasted longer than planned, some aircraft might exhaust their fuel before reaching Guadalcanal. A failure in any drop tank fuel system would force an immediate abort, as running out of fuel over enemy-held territory was a near-certain death sentence. The entire operation was balanced on a knife's edge. There was no room for error. Only flawless execution and a measure of luck could produce success. Another pilot asked what would happen if they failed to locate Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto. Mitchell's reply was direct and uncompromising. The mission would have consumed precious fuel, endangered 18 aircraft and their pilots, and left Japan's most capable naval strategist alive to continue directing operations. Failure, he made clear, was not an acceptable outcome. Then came the most troubling question of all. What were the actual odds of finding Yamamoto's aircraft in the vast sky over Bougainville after navigating 600 miles using only calculations and compass headings? Mitchell paused before answering. His estimate was stark, roughly 1 chance in 1,000. The room grew quiet. Despite the odds, the mission would proceed. The order came from Admiral Chester Nimitz, and beyond him, from President Franklin D. Roosevelt. Yamamoto had been the architect of Pearl Harbor. Now, the United States had a rare opportunity to strike back. Mitchell dismissed the pilots and instructed them to rest as much as possible. Takeoff was scheduled for 7:25 a.m. The following morning, April 18, 1943, exactly 1 year after the Doolittle raid on Tokyo. Unlike some coincidences of war, this date was chosen deliberately. Operation Vengeance was designed not only as a tactical strike, but as a symbolic one. That night, ground crews worked methodically through final preparations. All 18 P-38 Lightnings underwent thorough inspections. Engines were run, fuel lines tested, and external tanks filled and checked for leaks. Ammunition belts were loaded into each aircraft's 450 caliber machine guns and the single 20mm cannon mounted in the nose. Some pilots etched brief messages into bomb casings or ammunition containers. Others wrote letters to their families, unable to say where they were headed or what they would attempt. Sleep came easily to almost no one. Meanwhile, 400 miles to the northwest at Rabaul, Admiral Yamamoto prepared for his own journey. His staff strongly advised against the trip. American air activity in the region had increased, and long-range P-38 fighters had recently been sighted far beyond their previously assumed limits. Yamamoto's itinerary was precise and predictable, an obvious risk. Nevertheless, he refused to cancel. Japanese morale throughout the Solomon Islands was fragile after months of setbacks. Soldiers needed to see their commander in person. Canceling the inspection, Yamamoto believed, would signal doubt and weaken resolve. The visit would proceed as planned. That morning, Yamamoto chose to wear a khaki army uniform rather than his customary naval attire. The choice was unusual but practical. The bases he intended to inspect were primarily army installations, and appearing in army dress would help put the troops at ease. After gathering his documents and saying farewell to the officers remaining at Rabaul, Yamamoto walked out to the airfield. 2 Gu-4M Betty bombers waited with engines already running. Yamamoto boarded the lead aircraft, accompanied by his personal aide and the fleet medical officer. Vice Admiral Matomu Ugaki, Yamamoto's chief of staff, was assigned to the second bomber with additional staff officers. Though the two men had traditionally flown together, Yamamoto made a last-minute decision to separate their flights. That decision, unknowingly, spared Ugaki's life. Shortly after 6 a.m. Tokyo time, approximately 8 a.m. local time at Rabaul, the two bombers lifted off. 6 fighter aircraft from the 204th Air Group provided escort, flying in 2 3-plane V formations. The group climbed to an altitude of about 6,500 feet, ideal for fuel economy and visibility, before turning southeast toward Bougainville at a steady speed of roughly 180 miles per hour. The flight was expected to take just over an hour. Yamamoto settled into his seat and reviewed notes for upcoming meetings at Balale and Buin. He had no reason to suspect danger. The flight details had been transmitted using what Japanese intelligence believed was a secure naval cipher. American forces, he was assured, could not possibly know his route or schedule. Back at Henderson Field on Guadalcanal, the American pilots forced down breakfast despite their nerves. At 7:10 a.m., they walked toward their aircraft. The 18 P-38 Lightning sat lined up on the runway, each carrying nearly 3,000 pounds of fuel in internal tanks and drop tanks. The heavy load would make takeoff difficult, but it was the only way the mission could succeed. Within minutes, one of the most precise and daring interception missions of the Second World War was about to begin. Henderson Field offered little margin for error. Its dirt runway stretched to roughly 2,000 feet, sufficient for routine sorties, but barely adequate for heavily laden fighters carrying extra fuel. On the morning of April 18, 1943, Admiral Mark Mitchell positioned himself at the far end of the strip, watching every aircraft depart. He knew precisely how much depended on this mission and how narrow the line was between success and disaster. At exactly 7:25 a.m., Major John Mitchell advanced the throttles of his P-38 Lightning and released the brakes. The aircraft responded sluggishly, burdened by additional fuel tanks that pushed it close to its performance limits. The ground rushed past as the runway disappeared beneath the nose. With scarcely 50 feet of dirt remaining, Mitchell lifted off, climbing away at a shallow angle, his aircraft barely clearing the end of the strip. 17 more Lightnings followed, launching at 30-second intervals. Once airborne, the fighters gathered over the waters east of Guadalcanal, gradually spreading into a loose combat formation. It was there that the first problem surfaced. First Lieutenant Joseph Moore reported that his external fuel tanks were not feeding fuel properly. The selector valves had failed. With no way to continue the mission, Moore was forced to turn back. His participation ended before it truly began. Moments later, another emergency unfolded. First Lieutenant James McClanahan felt a violent jolt as his right tire disintegrated during the takeoff roll. Rubber fragments tore away from the wheel as the aircraft accelerated. McClanahan managed to maintain control and lift off, but returning to Henderson with a blown tire was far too dangerous. He followed Moore back, eliminating a second aircraft from the strike force. With 2 fighters lost before reaching open water, Mitchell made an immediate adjustment. He reassigned 2 pilots from the top cover element, Lieutenants Holmes and Hine, to reinforce the 4-plane killer flight led by Thomas Lanphier and Rex Barber. Their task was direct attack on the Japanese bombers, while Mitchell retained command of the remaining aircraft to counter any enemy fighters. 16 P-38 seconds now turned south, descending to just 50 feet above the Pacific. Radio silence was absolute. Pilots relied solely on visual contact and hand signals. At times, sea spray drifted up and flecked the canopies. Some aviators later recalled seeing sharks gliding through the clear tropical water below, while others passed the time counting floating debris. One pilot even admitted to briefly nodding off, trusting Mitchell's navigation entirely. The flight was physically draining. The sun beat down relentlessly, turning cockpits into ovens. Pilots sat atop parachutes, life rafts, and survival packs, enduring cramped and uncomfortable positions for more than 2 hours. Navigation depended on the most basic instruments: compass, airspeed indicator, and wristwatch. Mitchell constantly assessed wind drift by studying wave patterns on the ocean surface, making subtle heading corrections when he detected lateral movement. Precision was critical. A deviation of even 1 degree, sustained over such distance, would place the formation miles from its target. There would be no opportunity to search. Fuel reserves were calculated down to the last gallon. If the enemy was missed, the mission would fail outright. To reduce the risk of detection, Mitchell guided the formation along a multi-leg route that curved widely across the Pacific. First southwest from Guadalcanal, then arcing northwest, and finally turning north toward the interception zone. The indirect path added distance but kept them clear of Japanese-occupied islands where coast watchers might raise an alarm. Minute by minute, the aircraft pressed on. Below them, the ocean stretched endlessly in every direction. Fuel gauges crept downward as the Allison engines consumed the precious gasoline supplied by drop tanks that had been officially prohibited, yet quietly authorized for this operation. At 9:33 a.m., after 2 hours and 3 minutes in the air, Mitchell sighted the coastline of Bougainville Island. He checked his watch. The timing was exact. They had reached the designated point precisely as planned. The navigation had been flawless. Breaking radio silence for the first time since takeoff, Mitchell transmitted a short warning to the formation. Enemy aircraft ahead. Eyes immediately scanned the sky. At 6,500 feet, exactly where intelligence estimates had predicted, 2 Japanese Gi-4M Betty bombers appeared, flying in loose formation with 6-0 fighters as escort. The group was descending toward Balali Airfield roughly 15 minutes from landing. Everything aligned. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto was on schedule and exactly where decoded messages had indicated. The improbability of the mission, once considered nearly impossible, had suddenly paid off. The time was 9:34 a.m., just 1 minute earlier than Mitchell's calculated interception window. Over a 600-mile flight, his timing error was less than 60 seconds. At Mitchell's signal, the P-38 seconds jettisoned their drop tanks. 3,000 pounds of aluminum and fuel fell away from each fighter, tumbling into the sea and erupting in trails of white spray. Throttles were pushed forward, engines surged as turbochargers spooled up. The Lightnings accelerated and climbed aggressively, seeking altitude and speed advantage. Lanfear and Barber led the 4-aircraft killer element downward toward the bombers, while Mitchell guided the remaining fighters upward to 18,000 feet, positioning them to intercept any Zeros launching from Kahili Airfield. The Japanese crews saw them almost immediately. From the lead Betty, the twin boom silhouettes were unmistakable American fighters where none were expected. The bomber pilot threw his aircraft into a steep diving turn toward the jungle, hoping to reach treetop level where pursuit would be difficult. The second bomber followed suit. Simultaneously, the 6 escorting Zeros rolled into sharp dives, accelerating toward the climbing P-38 seconds. Lanfear recognized the threat instantly. Abandoning his attack run on the bombers, he pulled into a steep climbing turn and charged directly into the descending Zeros. His guns fired, tracers ripping through the enemy formation. The Japanese fighters scattered, their coordinated attack broken. Lanfear had sacrificed his opportunity to strike the bombers in order to protect the mission. That left Rex Barber alone with a clear path to the lead Betty, Yamamoto's aircraft. Barber pressed forward, positioned behind and below the bomber as it tore along just 50 feet above the jungle canopy. Engines screamed at maximum output. The distance closed rapidly, 200 yards, then 100. Barber was flying a borrowed P-38, Miss Virginia, loaned by Lieutenant Robert Pettit. He squeezed the trigger. 450 caliber machine guns and a 20mm cannon fired in unison. The streams of tracers converged on the bomber's right engine. Metal shredded away from the cowling, and flames erupted, trailing thick black smoke. Barber adjusted his aim, sweeping fire across the fuselage toward the left engine. More impacts followed. White vapor streamed from ruptured lines. The Betty rolled violently to the left. Barber narrowly avoided collision, pulling up sharply. Glancing back, he saw the bomber plunging downward, both engines failing. It slammed into the jungle and vanished in an explosion of fire and shattered vegetation. There was no time for celebration. Enemy fighters swarmed the area. Barber broke hard into defensive maneuvers, attempting to shake 2 Zeros locked onto his tail. His aircraft shuddered as rounds struck home. Warning lights flashed as pieces of metal tore away from wings and fuselage. Fighting the controls, Barber disengaged and turned south toward Guadalcanal, unsure whether his damaged fighter could survive the 400-mile return flight. Meanwhile, Holmes and Hine had finally managed to release their jammed drop tanks. They spotted the second Betty carrying Admiral Matome Ugaki skimming the ocean surface near the coast. Holmes attacked first, scoring hits on the bomber's right engine. Smoke poured out, but his speed carried him past before he could finish the job. Hine followed with a sustained burst. Despite his damaged aircraft, Barber returned for one final pass. Additional rounds struck home. The Betty's pilot lost control, and the aircraft slammed into the sea near Moyla Point, disintegrating in a towering explosion of spray and debris. Inside the wreckage, Ugaki felt water rushing in as the fuselage broke apart. Darkness followed. When he regained consciousness, he found himself afloat in the ocean, supported by his life vest, one of only 3 survivors from the second bomber. The mission had achieved its objective. Against staggering odds, timing, navigation, and execution had converged with near-perfect precision. By the time the Japanese bomber began its fatal descent, there were no survivors left aboard. The Mitsubishi Gefor M Betty that carried Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto had been decisively struck. Above the main interception point, Major John Mitchell's high cover element was fully engaged, locked in a chaotic aerial battle as Japanese Zero fighters rushed in from airfields near Kahili to defend the formation. Despite the intensity of the dogfight, American losses were minimal. Not a single P-38 Lightning was destroyed during this phase, although several aircraft sustained damage from enemy fire. As Mitchell scanned the horizon, his attention was drawn to a thick plume of dark smoke rising from the jungle west of the village of WWII. He immediately recognized its significance. That column marked the crash of the lead Betty, the aircraft believed to be carrying Yamamoto himself. The primary objective had been achieved. With fuel reserves now dangerously low, Mitchell gave the order to disengage. The formation turned away from the combat zone and set a course for home. The fighters had already remained over hostile territory for 11 minutes, 1 minute longer than the carefully calculated limit. Every second beyond that margin increased the risk of failing to reach Henderson Field on Guadalcanal. To conserve what fuel they had left, the P-38 seconds climbed to higher altitude, where thinner air would improve engine efficiency. Inside the cockpits, fuel gauges told an unsettling story. Several pilots reported levels dropping faster than expected. For Captain Rex Barber, the situation was especially grim. His aircraft had suffered severe damage, including ruptured fuel tanks that left a faint vapor trail stretching behind him. As gasoline steadily leaked away, Barber ran the numbers in his head. The calculation offered little comfort. Still, turning back was not an option. Capture or death awaited behind enemy lines. He pressed on, carefully managing his engines while watching the needles sink toward empty. Not every pilot would make it back. During the engagement, First Lieutenant Raymond Hine vanished. No one witnessed his aircraft being hit or falling from the sky. Japanese records later confirmed that no Zero fighters were lost that day, making it unlikely that Hine had been shot down in air-to-air combat. The more probable explanation is that his P-38 was damaged perhaps by debris from a disintegrating bomber or by ground fire, and that he either ditched at sea or crashed deep in the jungle. Search operations continued until May 28, 1943, but no trace of him was ever found. Nearly a year later, on April 19, 1944, Hine was officially declared dead. His remains were ultimately classified as unrecoverable. The remaining 15 Lightnings flew southward across hundreds of miles of open ocean. Anxiety grew with every passing minute. External drop tanks emptied and were released one after another. Soon, pilots were relying solely on internal fuel, which was also rapidly diminishing. Several aviators calculated that they might exhaust their reserves before reaching Guadalcanal. In response, the formation tightened. If they were forced to ditch at sea, they would do so together. A cluster of downed pilots stood a far better chance of survival and rescue than isolated individuals scattered across the vast Pacific. Against the odds, they made it. One by one, the P-38 seconds touched down at Henderson Field with fuel gauges hovering near zero. Barber's aircraft in particular astonished ground crews. Mechanics later counted exactly 104 bullet holes riddling the fuselage and wings. The underside of the aircraft bore a deep dent from collision debris, and the intercooler had been damaged as well. That the fighter had remained airborne for roughly 400 miles in such condition bordered on the miraculous. Debriefings began immediately. Intelligence officers gathered accounts from every pilot. Mitchell described the smoke column rising west of WWII. Barber reported destroying a Betty bomber at that precise location. Lieutenant Lanfear stated that he had engaged enemy fighters and may have struck a bomber, though he could not be certain. The confusion of combat made exact attribution difficult, but consensus quickly formed around one conclusion. At least one Betty had been shot down, very likely both. The critical question remained unanswered. Had Yamamoto been aboard one of those aircraft? Confirmation would take time. The crash sites lay deep within rugged jungle terrain, accessible only on foot. Meanwhile, secrecy was paramount. If Japanese commanders suspected that their encrypted communications had been compromised, they would immediately change their cipher systems, eliminating a vital American intelligence advantage. To protect that secret, Mitchell and Admiral Halsey moved quickly. Additional long-range P-38 missions were planned throughout the Solomon Islands. These operations were designed to create a pattern, making it appear that American fighters now routinely penetrated deep into Japanese-controlled airspace. The destruction of Yamamoto's aircraft would seem like a chance encounter, one success among many rather than the result of precise intelligence and deliberate planning. Japanese recovery teams reached the primary crash site on April 19, 1943, one day after the interception. The wreckage of the Betty was strewn across a steep jungle hillside. Admiral Yamamoto's body was found still secured in his seat, which had been thrown clear during the impact. His gloved hand remained wrapped around the hilt of his ceremonial katana. 2 gunshot wounds had killed him instantly. One .50 caliber round entered through his lower left jaw and exited near his right eye. Another struck his left shoulder. The trajectory of the wounds indicated an attack from behind and below, precisely matching Barber's account of the engagement. A forensic examination conducted by Japanese medical officers confirmed the findings. Both wounds were caused by .50 caliber ammunition, consistent with the armament of the P-38 Lightning. The head wound was immediately fatal. Yamamoto had died at the moment of impact, before the aircraft struck the ground. His body showed no injuries attributable to the crash itself, further confirming that death occurred in the air. Initially, Japan concealed the loss. Official acknowledgement was delayed until May 21, 1943, more than a month after the shootdown. When the announcement was finally made, it sent shockwaves through the nation. Yamamoto was not merely a senior officer, he was a symbol. The architect of early Japanese victories and the mastermind behind Pearl Harbor was gone. The public was told only that he had died during combat operations. The true circumstances remained undisclosed. Although Japanese military leaders suspected weaknesses in their communications security, they never conclusively proved that the JN-25 naval code had been broken. In the United States, Operation Vengeance remained classified. The pilots involved were instructed to remain silent, but complete secrecy proved impossible. In late May 1943, Time magazine published a brief item hinting at the mission. Then, in October of the same year, the magazine released a far more detailed article describing the interception and incorrectly crediting Captain Thomas Lanphier with shooting down Yamamoto. The disclosure enraged Navy intelligence officials who understood the implications for code-breaking security. A formal investigation was launched to identify the source of the leak, but no definitive conclusion was reached. Lanphier himself fell under suspicion, though no charges were ever filed. The fallout was significant. Major John Mitchell had been nominated for the Medal of Honor for his extraordinary navigation and leadership skills that made the mission possible. After the publication compromised operational security, his nomination was reduced to the Navy Cross. While still a prestigious award, it was not the nation's highest military honor. All pilots who participated in the mission ultimately received Navy Crosses, recognizing their bravery and success. Yet many historians agree that Mitchell's achievement merited the Medal of Honor and that the loss of secrecy cost him that distinction. The debate over who actually brought down Admiral Yamamoto's plane persisted for many years. Lanphier claimed responsibility, recounting a dramatic version in which he had climbed over the Zeros before diving onto Yamamoto's Betty from above. His narrative, well suited for public speeches and interviews, helped him maintain visibility during his post-war political career. In contrast, Barber insisted that Lanphier never had an opportunity to strike Yamamoto's bomber, asserting that he alone had pursued the lead Betty into the dense jungle and destroyed it. Eyewitnesses, among other American pilots, largely corroborated Barber's version. The initial confusion was fueled by the fact that 2 Betty bombers were shot down, leaving Americans uncertain at first which plane actually carried the Admiral. Years later, testimony from Japanese survivors, combined with physical evidence, finally settled the controversy. Forensic analysis of the wreckage, Yamamoto's autopsy, and statements from Japanese Zero pilots who observed the attack all confirmed Barber's account. He had fired from behind and slightly below, precisely matching the trajectory of the bullets, which entered from the rear and passed forward through Yamamoto's body. Lanphier, meanwhile, had engaged Japanese escort fighters, sacrificing his chance to target the bomber in order to protect his wingmen. Both aviators displayed remarkable courage, yet historical records now definitively attribute the fatal shots to Rex Barber. In 1991, an Air Force review attempted a compromise, officially granting each pilot credit for half of the kill. This bureaucratic decision satisfied neither party and overlooked the substantial evidence supporting Barber. Recognition of the truth came too late for him. Barber passed away in 2003, still striving for proper acknowledgement, while Lanier, who died in 1987, maintained his claim until the end. Yamamoto's death had an immediate and profound impact on Japanese naval operations. He was succeeded as Commander-in-Chief of the Combined Fleet by Admiral Minichi Koga, a capable yet unremarkable strategist lacking Yamamoto's vision and aggressiveness. Following April 1943, the Japanese Navy shifted toward defensive measures and reactive tactics, surrendering the strategic initiative in the Pacific to the United States. Major Japanese victories became a thing of the past, and the eventual retreat toward the home islands commenced. Beyond the loss of Yamamoto, Operation Vengeance carried broader consequences. American codebreakers had demonstrated that Japanese naval communications were vulnerable, though Tokyo never fully accepted the extent of this breach. Japan's failure to overhaul its cipher systems allowed Allied intelligence to continue monitoring Japanese operational plans throughout the war, offering a decisive advantage that helped shorten the conflict and preserve countless American lives. Yamamoto's funeral, held on June 5, 1943, was deliberately scheduled to coincide with the 9th anniversary of Admiral Togo's funeral, symbolically linking Yamamoto to Japan's greatest naval hero. He was posthumously promoted to Marshal Admiral, the highest rank in the Imperial Japanese Navy, and awarded the Order of the Chrysanthemum. Germany also honored him with the Knight's Cross of the Iron Cross with oak leaves and swords, one of its most prestigious military decorations. His remains were divided, part interred at Tokyo's Tama Cemetery beside Admiral Togo, and the rest placed in his family's burial grounds at Chuko Temple in Nagaoka City. The technological advances that enabled Operation Vengeance were equally critical. The development of external drop tanks championed by Kelsey despite opposition from bomber advocates in November 1941 was instrumental. These modifications, implemented by Lockheed, equipped the P-38 seconds at Henderson Field with the fuel capacity required for the long-range mission. Without this foresight, Yamamoto's inspection tour would have been completed uninterrupted. The impact of drop tanks extended far beyond Yamamoto's assassination. Throughout 1943 and 1944, American fighters outfitted with external fuel tanks significantly increased their operational range in both the European and Pacific theaters. P-38 Lightnings with drop tanks escorted bombers deep into Germany, reducing losses to Luftwaffe attacks. In the Pacific, P-38 seconds conducted strikes exceeding 1,000 miles, reaching Japanese bases previously out of range. The P-51 Mustang, when similarly equipped, could accompany bombers from England to Berlin and back, while the P-47 Thunderbolt became a formidable long-range fighter bomber. By 1944, even the staunchest bomber proponents had to accept the necessity of drop tanks. Their integration transformed strategic planning, making long-range fighter escorts routine and improving bomber crew survival rates dramatically. Missions that had once carried catastrophic risks now became statistically survivable, saving thousands of lives. Charles Lindbergh's later contributions to extending P-38 range in mid-1944 further enhanced these capabilities, arriving more than a year after the Yamamoto mission. Ultimately, the combination of precise intelligence, courageous pilots, and innovative technology, including code-breaking and extended fighter range, cemented the success of Operation Vengeance and demonstrated the critical importance of integrating innovation with tactical execution in modern warfare. Charles Lindbergh was barred from military enlistment during World War II because of his outspoken opposition to U.S. involvement before the conflict began. Despite this, his aviation expertise remained invaluable. Rather than serving in uniform, he joined United Aircraft as a civilian technical advisor. In that role, he traveled to the Pacific Theater, arriving on April 24, 1944. Less than a month later, between May 21 and May 22, Lindbergh flew his first combat sortie alongside active duty pilots. From May through September of 1944, Lindbergh participated in roughly 50 combat missions. During this period, he introduced innovative fuel-saving flight techniques that significantly extended the operational range of the Lockheed P-38 Lightning. Drawing on his deep understanding of aircraft performance, he taught pilots to lower engine revolutions per minute to around 2,600, adjust carburetors to the autolean setting, and maintain slower cruising speeds. These methods dramatically reduced fuel consumption from approximately 90 gallons per hour to about 70, allowing aircraft to travel hundreds of additional miles. In some cases, the effective range increased by as much as 400 miles. Before Lindbergh's involvement, many P-38 pilots believed 6 to 8 hours represented the absolute endurance limit for a mission. After adopting his techniques, crews discovered they could remain airborne for as long as 10 hours. However, these improvements arrived too late to influence one of the most famous missions of the war, Operation Vengeance. The success of Operation Vengeance relied on more conventional fuel management practices and depended entirely on the additional capacity provided by external drop tanks. The mission's feasibility rested on earlier engineering decisions, particularly modifications introduced by Benjamin Kelsey, which made the long-range flight possible in the first place. Precise navigation by Major John Mitchell guided the fighters across vast stretches of open ocean to the interception point at exactly the right moment. Once there, Lieutenant Rex Barber's calm execution and precise gunnery brought down Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto's Mitsubishi Gi-4M Betty bomber. The P-38 Lightning, equipped with systems that quietly defied official doctrine, proved itself to be the only American fighter capable of completing such a mission. Throughout the Pacific War, the P-38 Lightning established itself as one of the most effective American combat aircraft. P-38 units were credited with destroying more than 1,800 Japanese planes. Over 100 Lightning pilots achieved ace status by scoring 5 or more confirmed victories. Notably, the two highest-scoring American aces of World War II, Major Richard Bong, with 40 confirmed kills, and Major Thomas Maguire, with 38, both flew the P-38 exclusively in the Pacific. Its exceptional range, mechanical dependability, and concentrated firepower made it uniquely suited for the immense distances and demanding conditions of that theater. By the end of the war, total P-38 production reached between 10,037 and 10,038 aircraft, depending on whether prototype and experimental models are included. The Lightning served in every major theater of World War II. While it achieved its greatest successes in the Pacific and Mediterranean regions, it saw diminishing use in Europe, where it was gradually supplanted by the P-51 Mustang, an aircraft better optimized for high-altitude combat. In contrast, the Pacific theater emphasized long overwater flights and the safety of twin-engine reliability, ensuring the P-38 remained a frontline fighter until the final days of the war. Despite its broad combat record, the P-38's most enduring legacy remains its role in Operation Vengeance. The successful interception and killing of Yamamoto demonstrated that even the most carefully guarded operational plans could be penetrated by superior intelligence capabilities. It challenged prevailing assumptions about the limits of fighter range and showed that precision strikes could be executed far beyond what military planners once believed possible. Perhaps most importantly, it underscored how technological innovation, sometimes achieved by quietly bending or ignoring established rules, could produce strategic outcomes that altered the course of a war. The individuals responsible for Operation Vengeance came from vastly different backgrounds, yet their combined efforts formed an unbroken chain of success. Benjamin Kelsey, an engineer and test pilot, understood when regulations needed to be set aside in service of a greater objective. John Mitchell, a fighter pilot from Mississippi, possessed the navigational skill to guide aircraft more than 600 miles across open ocean using little more than a compass and a wristwatch. Rex Barber, a young lieutenant, remained composed amid the chaos of aerial combat and delivered lethal fire under extreme pressure. Admiral Mark Nimitz recognized the intelligence opportunity and moved swiftly to exploit it, while Fleet Admiral Chester Nimitz accepted the enormous risk of revealing cryptographic capabilities, believing Yamamoto's death justified the danger. Behind the scenes, U.S. Navy cryptanalysts including Edwin Layton, Tommy Dyer, Alva Laswell, and traffic analyst John Paul Stevens provided the intelligence foundation upon which the entire operation depended. None of these contributors could have succeeded alone. Intelligence without aircraft capable of reaching Bougainville would have been meaningless. Navigation without drop tanks would have made the flight impossible. Accurate gunfire would never have found its target without decoded messages revealing Yamamoto's itinerary. Operation Vengeance succeeded because every link in this chain functioned perfectly. After the war, the men involved dispersed into civilian and military careers, often carrying memories they were forbidden to discuss for decades due to the mission's classified status. John Mitchell retired from the U.S. Air Force as a colonel and lived until 1995. Rex Barber became a civil engineer and spent much of his later life seeking formal recognition for his role in downing Yamamoto's aircraft. He died in 2003. Thomas Lamphere pursued a career in politics and continued to claim credit for the kill until his death in 1987. Admiral Mark Nimitz went on to command carrier task forces throughout the Pacific War, earning a reputation as one of the U.S. Navy's most aggressive and effective leaders. Years of sustained combat took a severe toll on his health, and he died in 1947. Admiral William Halsey became one of America's most celebrated naval commanders and passed away in 1959. Chester Nimitz retired as Fleet Admiral and lived until 1966, witnessing the transformation of naval warfare through the advent of nuclear-powered submarines and aircraft carriers. On the Japanese side, Admiral Matomi Ugaki survived the crash of the second Betty bomber during Operation Vengeance. He continued serving in the Imperial Japanese Navy until the war's final hours. On August 15, 1945, only hours after Japan announced its surrender, Ugaki led one final kamikaze mission against Allied ships near Okinawa. His aircraft was shot down, killing him. In accordance with the samurai ethos that shaped his life, he chose death rather than the perceived shame of surrender. Benjamin Kelsey, despite his pivotal contributions, received little public recognition during his lifetime. His work on external fuel tanks for the P-38 remained classified for many years after the war ended. He was eventually promoted to Brigadier General on September 5, 1952, and retired from military service on December 31, 1955. Benjamin Kelsey spent his professional life shaping American air power from behind the scenes. After the Second World War, he continued working in the aerospace sector, advising on advanced fighter aircraft programs as jet aviation transformed military aviation. Despite his central role in events that altered the course of the Pacific War, Kelsey never pursued public recognition. When he died on March 3, 1981, at the age of 74, he had witnessed an extraordinary technological arc. From the piston-engine P-38 Lightnings he helped bring to life to supersonic fighters such as the F-15 Eagle dominating the skies. Although Kelsey possessed extensive experience as a test pilot, he never flew combat missions. His superiors judged his technical knowledge too valuable to risk in frontline operations. That decision proved wise because his influence on American fighter development reached far beyond a single wartime operation. He played a key role in advancing the P-51 Mustang, widely regarded as one of the most effective fighter aircraft of the Second World War. He also championed the P-80 Shooting Star, which became the United States' first operational jet fighter and marked the beginning of a new era in aerial warfare. The events surrounding Operation Vengeance offer lessons that extend well beyond the targeted killing of Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto. At its core, the story highlights a persistent dilemma faced by military institutions: how to reconcile standardized doctrine with rapidly changing technology. Rules and regulations exist for good reasons. They create order, predictability, and coordination across large organizations. Yet when those same rules harden into dogma, they can become obstacles to survival. Kelsey understood this tension with unusual clarity. He recognized that the prevailing doctrine promoted by the so-called bomber mafia, which discouraged the use of external fuel tanks on fighters, was fundamentally flawed. He anticipated that future conflicts would demand long-range escort fighters capable of operating far beyond existing limits. Rather than complying passively with regulations he believed were dangerous, Kelsey made a calculated choice. Without written authorization, he approved modifications and accepted full personal responsibility should his decision fail. That quiet act of defiance produced capabilities that made Operation Vengeance possible and saved countless lives in the years that followed. The mission itself was steeped in irony. Yamamoto, the architect of Pearl Harbor, had long opposed war with the United States because he understood that American industrial power would eventually overwhelm Japan. He was ultimately killed by precisely the type of technological innovation he feared. His death also stemmed from overconfidence in Japanese encryption systems, which were less secure than their designers believed. Even his own strict punctuality contributed to his vulnerability, allowing American planners to predict his movements with deadly precision. The American decision-makers who approved Operation Vengeance accepted enormous risks. They endangered their code-breaking capabilities, the most valuable intelligence asset they possessed, for the chance to eliminate a single individual. Had Japan realized its communications were compromised, the consequences could have been catastrophic. That realization never came, but the danger was real. Whether the gamble was justified remains a subject of debate. Yamamoto's successor was less capable, yet by April 1943 Japan's strategic position was already collapsing under the weight of material disadvantage. Perhaps the deepest irony is that Yamamoto's death had limited strategic effect. Its greatest impact was psychological. Japanese morale suffered from the loss of a national hero, while American morale surged with what was seen as long-delayed retribution for Pearl Harbor. But the outcome of the Pacific War was not decided by individual leaders. It was decided by production capacity. American shipyards launched aircraft carriers faster than Japan could destroy them. U.S. factories produced aircraft in numbers Japan could not hope to match. The arithmetic of industrial war was unforgiving, and Yamamoto understood that reality better than many of his contemporaries. External fuel tanks, the very innovation that made Operation Vengeance feasible, remain indispensable 8 decades later. Modern fighters still rely on them to extend operational reach. Today's tanks are built from advanced composite materials capable of enduring higher speeds and greater aerodynamic stress than the aluminum designs Lockheed engineers created for the P-38. The F-15 Eagle typically flies with 3 external tanks carrying roughly 350 gallons of fuel. The F-16 Fighting Falcon regularly operates with 2 or 3 tanks depending on mission demands. The F-A-18 Super Hornet uses external tanks to conduct strike missions hundreds of miles from its carrier base. Even stealth aircraft must compromise. The F-35 Lightning II can mount external tanks in environments where extended range outweighs the need for maximum stealth, accepting temporary radar visibility in exchange for greater operational flexibility. From an economic perspective, external tanks remain highly efficient. A modern composite drop tank costs tens of thousands of dollars. By contrast, a single aerial refueling sortie can cost hundreds of thousands. For missions within their range limits, drop tanks are far more cost-effective than tanker support. This cost advantage ensures their continued relevance regardless of advances in aerial refueling technology. Ultimately, Operation Vengeance is a case study in how innovation shapes military effectiveness. Kelsey identified a problem and acted decisively despite bureaucratic resistance. General Oliver P. Eccles provided institutional cover that prevented retaliation. Lockheed engineers transformed ideas into functional hardware with remarkable speed. Navy cryptanalysts delivered the intelligence foundation. Admiral Nimitz recognized the opportunity. John Mitchell navigated flawlessly. Rex Barber executed with precision and courage. Every contribution mattered. Remove any single element, and the mission collapses. This interdependence reveals a deeper truth about organizational success. Innovation demands individuals willing to question established doctrine when it no longer serves reality. It also requires institutions capable of shielding innovators rather than punishing them. Technical brilliance must be matched by execution, and new capabilities must be embraced by commanders willing to use them creatively. When Benjamin Kelsey died, his obituary acknowledged his role in fighter development but largely ignored the defiance that enabled one of the most famous missions of the war. Public memory favors visible heroism. Pilots become legends. Engineers remain anonymous. Yet without engineers, military power cannot exist. Operation Vengeance succeeded because of cumulative effort across every level of the system. Intelligence, engineering, logistics, planning, and combat execution converged at precisely the right moment. 80 years later, modern militaries still depend on people like Kelsey. Officers who understand technology deeply enough to recognize when regulations obstruct survival, engineers who can rapidly convert ideas into tools, and leaders who can balance discipline with adaptability. That balance is never perfect. Excessive flexibility breeds chaos. Excessive rigidity invites obsolescence. In 1941, Kelsey and Eccles found the right equilibrium. Their judgment was confirmed in 1943, when P-38 Lightnings carrying once forbidden fuel tanks flew 1,000 miles to kill the man who planned Pearl Harbor. The mission stands as proof that wars are not won solely by battlefield heroics. They are shaped by innovation, by moral courage within bureaucracies, and by individuals willing to accept risk so others may live. In the end, Operation Vengeance was not just the story of an ambush. It was the story of how one engineer's unauthorized decision quietly altered the trajectory of a global conflict, and how the most decisive battles are often fought far from the front lines.